There came a point in my life where I closed my business, sold my car, said a gentle goodbye to the woman I'd been with for a few years, handed the keys of my home to someone I barely knew, and disappeared. Not with much of an announcement or manifesto, I just quietly left, bent on finding the absolute deepest truth, to the point of being willing to sacrifice everything I thought I was and everything I thought I had for the answer. And in a way I couldn't have imagined or fully understood until after it happened, that truth did arise and blossom into awareness that turned this life upside down. What I found and what I want to share with you today isn't what most people expect when they hear the words awakening or enlightenment. It's stranger than the myth, and I'd argue far more interesting. So I want to invite you to come and take a tour. I want to show you what it's actually like inside a mind that's gone through this kind of awakening shift. So your journey is perhaps a little smoother. What changes? What doesn't? What the mythology gets wrong, and what the genuine promise actually is, which turns out to be even more remarkable than the fairy tale version. Enlightenment is frequently sold as the end of all problems. No more suffering, no more difficulty, no more messy human challenges. A permanent state of bliss, almost like a drug high that never ends. And maybe even some magical abilities get thrown in for good measure. And honestly, how wouldn't that be entrancing? Life here can be messy and chaotic. Sometimes it seems dull or unpleasant or just really hard. So of course the idea of a permanent exit from all that is seductive. And some of the most celebrated spiritual traditions refer to enlightenment as the end of all suffering. Doesn't that sound good? It's just very human to want more ease, more peace, and more flow. So in the marketplace of ideas, enlightenment is an easy sell to egos that want an improved version of themselves or a better experience as that ego defines it. It's just that improving your life turns out to be a deeply secondary effect of awakening. It's a corollary to awakening, not the main event. There's so much more to the story. To me, by the way, awakening and enlightenment are the same thing. I use the words interchangeably. So what are these things actually? What do these words point to? Most literally, they describe how we begin to see the deepest truth of who and what we are. We go from the blindness of the dark to turning the lights on. In that light, in that enlightenment, we see clearly. We open our eyes to the light, like when we awaken from sleeping. And what does awakening to the light actually show us? At its absolute core, it shows us that the separated, individuated sense of self is not true. It's a falsehood, an illusion. And if that separateness isn't true, then the natural default is something unseparated, unindividuated, and very, very whole. This is the great gift and the great seeming paradox. And when encountered directly, it can be a bit of a mind-blowing experience at first, since most people are just trying to get to work on time, not to deconstruct their entire sense of who they are. Let me try to show you what I mean. Come, take a walk with me for a moment, in your mind. Look inwardly as we walk together. Look at how all the thoughts and feelings arise in your mind, how they come and eventually go. And now look past them into the field of awareness in which they arise. Look past all the fears and all the judgments and see clearly what is beyond them. In pristine and shining light, there is awareness that looks upon all the fears and judgments, unencumbered and unaffected by them. Totally unlike the small, separate sense of self that seemed to hold them a little while. That small self is recognized to be as ephemeral as they are. A movement of mind, a mirage, an illusion of something made up, and finally seen as the fiction it has always been. And without it, there's nothing there for the fears and judgments to cling to. Without them, the separated sense of self is gone too. And so with nothing separated, all is just one thing. With all perception appearing as one thing, it's very whole. When something is completely whole, it's missing nothing. And when missing nothing, there's no perception of lack or want or need. With no sense of lack or want or need, how can there be any fear? With no fear at all, it's natural for the deepest peace to simply be present and overflowing, and therefore to be loving and kind and forgiving and not particularly attached to much of anything. Amen. That's what your deepest nature, the deepest truth of what you are, points to. Even if only glimpsed for a moment. And here's something that follows naturally from that glimpse. When you see this lack of a separate self in here, it becomes natural to see the same lack of a separate self out there, in everyone and everything else. In fact, it becomes natural to see the same freedom, the same peace, the same fundamental lovingness within them. Because none of the aspects of seeming separation are actually true. Inside, outside, no different, not separate. You may see it in them and in yourself, even if they themselves don't see it at all. This is how the notion that the world is illusory begins to be directly experienced, rather than merely philosophized about. And it can certainly lead, at least temporarily, to the experience that nothing much really needs to be done. Everything is fine as it is, even to the extent that your regular, ordinary life could fall completely apart, and you really don't give a damn. You're all right. You will be all right, even if it doesn't look that way from most people's perspectives. That's what happened to me anyway, which I'll say more about in a few minutes. Now, getting there is rarely a clean or comfortable process. In short, this is a perfectly natural passage that all minds will eventually go through. You're not getting out of it no matter what. It's coming for you eventually. The real question is merely how soon. Could be next week, could be after a few more lifetimes. And that depends more upon you than you might think, because it's the result of a deconstructive process in which the old ways we think and believe and therefore experience the world are let go of, which is something you do have some level of choice in. As those falsehoods and illusions are let go, the fundamental ground of truth that's always been there begins to dawn on the mind. And as that happens, two things tend to occur simultaneously. One, we begin to embrace the freedom and joy that releasing limitations always brings. The spirit begins to glow. Peace becomes a more natural set point. Life tends to become more benign, more joyful, more simple. And we begin to hear the inner guidance of something beyond the small self more clearly. The second thing that begins to happen is that the ego, which remains extremely invested in the old ways of thinking and being, puts up all kinds of resistance. We run into deeper and deeper layers of the fears we've built and held dear. And this can be somewhere between simply challenging and downright terrifying. Most people, like it was for me, will tend to experience swinging between these two polarities like a pendulum, one and then the other. The times of peace and loveliness are like sweet fruits that keep you headed in what is clearly the only direction that makes any real sense. And yet the pendulum swings the other way too. If you go deep and remain honest, your bones may rattle with existential dread as layer after layer of fear is exposed. Fears about control, about abandonment, about non-existence itself. The seeming paradox between these two experiences can feel baffling, and the terror of that dread can seduce what remains of the ego into clinging to its myths, wanting desperately to bypass the truth of its own unreality, until at some point the pendulum collapses and the truth of that oneness becomes abidingly, uncompromisingly clear It's like the scaffolding holding the ego in place, which has always been rickety, temporary, held together with desperation and the loosest of bolts, finally collapses and comes to rest on the ground of pure being with a great exhale. In relief, awareness finds itself serene and supported on immovable bedrock, where nothing can dislodge its foundation. So what does life look like on the other side of that collapse? The most basic description is simply this: living from less fear, which means more peace. Living with less judgment, which means more peace. The same personal preferences are still here, I still have them, but equilibrium no longer depends quite so much on them being met. Less fear in general makes it more natural to call out things as they actually are in real time, which can paradoxically look like passing greater judgment on the world, not less, but it's really just greater honesty about what we're seeing out there. And honesty leads to truth, and truth is still what ultimately sets us free. Less fear about what others think is another form of greater honesty. It's more honest about what is really in here, and makes upholding appropriate boundaries even more natural, not less. The simple willingness to say no becomes more vivid than ever. And it just isn't a problem. And while much of the time there is a great sense of flow, a sense that life has a direction and a current, and you can trust it, there are also still plenty of moments where the humanity of it all just shows up loud and clear. Bills, relationships of all kinds to navigate, some which are easy, some which are not, and the cat's litter box still needs cleaning. The body can still go haywire, physical pain still arises, and pain remains particularly powerful at pulling attention away from truth, whether it's physical difficulty or the loss of someone we love. There are many processes hardwired into the physical vessel, drives for oxygen, food, connection, and sex, and survival, which I'll address more specifically in upcoming videos, but they're worth naming here because they help explain something that surprises people. Even when the fear of death has genuinely fallen to zero, you still jump out of the way of oncoming buses, because that's what bodies do. The adrenaline surges, and then when you don't hold on to it, it subsides. Equilibrium returns, probably quickly, without a trace of trauma remaining. The awakened mind may recognize quietly that even if it hadn't managed to jump out of the way, that death is as much an illusion as birth was to begin with. What you most deeply are was never born and cannot die, which actually renders death by bus not that big of a deal. But you jump anyway, and then you move on with whatever is next in front of your nose. And emotions still arise too. Sadness, grief, despondency, even anger. Awakening tends to reduce the incidence of these, yes, but like buses in the street or pain in the body, they still show up when conditions, inner and outer, line up to bring them. No great spiritual avatar the world has ever known escaped the trials of physical life while they appeared to be here. So rest assured, you won't either. The question simply shifts. It's no longer, how do I avoid hard things or pray only good things happen? It becomes, from what ground will I meet whatever arises, both in the world, in front of my nose, and everything that arises within this mind? And crucially, will I meet what arises within me with the same kindness and acceptance and forgiveness that I might try to offer the outside world? Even when what arises inside includes pain or anger or anxiety or sadness or grief. If you want to explore that idea a little further, you can click and watch this video I did on the subject. In any case, everything is more embraced. Everything. The awakened mind may sit in the peace that passes understanding, knowing it's all okay. It may laugh outrageously at this absurd and ridiculous, or moan in anguish at the cruelty and insanity, or cry honestly in despair at loss, and even accept and forgive the clenching in the heart that can only be a vestige of the egoic separate self. In the beautiful words of my friend Ishtar Howell, what a joy it is to be ready to die at any moment. How crisp it all is to live vividly and give it all to the boundless beingness at the center of everything. If death comes for anything, it comes to free us from our clenching. I'm not here to be a guru and spin hype. I'm here to point honestly towards truth, which in this realm doesn't contain just the good parts. This dualistic world contains all the things, including beauty and horror. So if you're here, don't be surprised that you encounter both. The beauty may inspire joy, and the horrors may inspire tears. Awakening doesn't absolve you of experiencing all the aspects of this realm. It gives you a different frame of reference from which to meet it. And by meet it, I mean both the world out there and the world in here. It's one of the ways that two collapse into one. The distinction between outer and inner ceases to have meaning. They're seen as not fundamentally different at all. Nothing in the perceptual realm, whether outer or inner, is really different. It's all one thing, and so it is all met with greater forgiveness. Equanimity doesn't come from life unfolding perfectly. It comes from having a basis for peace that is founded on awareness beyond the limitations of this dualistic, chaotic world. When the personal self and the body it seems to reside in is seen as the only seat of being, suffering and eventually death can only be understood as inevitable, which is why the basic state of the ego is fundamentally terror. But when the awakening perspective opens up, that's no longer the only option. As the deeply enlightened St. Francis of Assisi put it, you wear the ego as a light garment. It's still there to some extent. It has to be, or you couldn't function here in this dimension at all. But it wears lightly, and the burdens of the world lighten with it. They don't always disappear. They lighten. No self. No problem. I'd like to share what some of this has actually looked like in my own life. I mentioned at the top that I walked away from everything. Closed the business, sold the car, said goodbye to the relationship, handed the keys of my home to someone I barely knew. And there's also, for anyone who may have come across it elsewhere, a near-death experience I went through at the age of 29, which is documented in several other places. I'll link to it in the description, along with the other videos I've mentioned. It was a very powerful signpost along this journey. It showed me a great deal about what is real and what is not. But what I've rarely said publicly is that it was not the most pivotal or transformative experience I would go through. That would come later, after many years of that pendulum experience I described. My life went into complete but quiet disarray for quite a while. I felt like my ability to function as an ordinary adult was simply falling apart, which is ultimately why I walked away from it completely. Not out of defeat, but out of a kind of desperate and total commitment to finding what was actually true. And that pendulum eventually did collapse into a piece that is often described as being beyond understanding, yet can still be experienced quite directly, here and now, by all of us. It's only described as being beyond understanding to the ego, which can't understand anything that doesn't revolve around itself as the center. But this was awareness without any sense of individuated self at the center, and thus a deep peace and rest beyond anything the ego can conceive. Yet something that can still be experienced in consciousness here and now, which will come to you as well. I dig more into my personal experience of the process I went through in this video here. if you like. But the core of the experience is this: the individuated sense of self is, itself, seen as the fiction. So whether awareness is experiencing something delightful or experiencing fear or grief or something else entirely, there's a space in which awareness recognizes that whatever the perceptual experience is, the awareness itself is unaffected by it. Which ultimately means it's okay for any perceptual experience to arise. It can be embraced by that awareness, regardless of what it contains. The pendulum collapsed, and what for years had seemed like a conflict between two opposing states just ceased being a conflict. The peace was carried right along into the other side of that pendulum, softening the fear until it didn't seem to matter much. It was all one thing, at least to that unindividuated awareness. And if it was all one, these two seemingly opposite aspects simply stopped being a contradiction. There was no longer any fight between them. There ceased to be any longing for one over the other because there was no longer a separation between them. If there's no fight and no conflict, peace is the natural default setting. Sometimes that peace is more in the foreground, sometimes more in the background. But even when there's grief or sadness or upset of some kind, the underlying awareness is still present. And in the collapse of that pendulum, this awareness became, as best I can describe it, permanent. Not perfect, permanent. By not perfect, I mean sometimes it really is more in the background, and the humanity within and out there pushes very human buttons. But it's still radically shifted, and in many ways dismantled how I see and experience the world. My own mind became very, very quiet of its own accord, especially for the first few years. With the seeming conflict of the pendulum over with, the natural default was non-conflict, peace, in other words, which is naturally very quiet. I would say approximately 70% of all the fear patterns I'd carried with me that my ego had created and clung to simply disappeared. Poof. A significant one for me was the fear around justifying myself, of not explaining myself. It was a behavior obviously rooted in the fear of not being accepted, a fear of being abandoned if I didn't put accomplishments on display or otherwise somehow justify my worth. That pattern, which had animated so much of my behavior, largely just went away. Another was the staunch belief that I had to be the absolute center of all meaningful decision-making in my world. Born out of fear that if I wasn't in firm control, everything would fall apart. But after the shift in awareness we call abiding awakening or enlightenment, that control was increasingly released more and more in favor of flow and in guidance that seems to come from far beyond the small self. Most of the former motivations that had animated my work life and social life turned out to have been bound really very tightly to those and other fear patterns. And with those patterns gone or very much lightened, much of my former life simply fell apart or dissipated. This deconstruction went on for some years before the shift and frequently seemed terrifying. After that shift, those structures simply no longer had value. And if something is really seen and understood as valueless, there's no trauma or hesitation in letting it go. So in the end, their passing was not experienced as a meaningful loss at all. The year that followed was largely silent for me. There was no sense of loss in this. There was simply no impulse to speak. Silence seemed, and often still does, like simply the best vessel for holding the experience that was unfolding around me. It's an odd way to be a grown-up, but it seemed necessary and called for at the time, and was easily embraced. There were also other processes that unfolded. A year or so of intense dreams that seemed to be the mind releasing deep and deeper layers of fear and past trauma. Despite the terrible imagery in them, I would wake feeling released, peaceful, even refreshed, as though I'd lightened the load. There was also a long series of what are often called Kundalini experiences for me that still occasionally manifest. Maybe the most unusual of these was the repeated experience of encountering the collective suffering of all of mankind, all 8 billion souls, and yet knowing with perfect clarity that awareness can look upon and past even this without being troubled or harmed, and therefore offers a path to transmute it. This experience still occasionally comes to pass for me. It can look a little wild from the outside, but inwardly evokes not the slightest fear or trauma. And while I'm skipping over many experiences here because it's genuinely impossible to include everything in one video, there's one more area worth naming before we close. When one's eyes are opened in awakening, when the lights turn on in enlightenment, we tend to see more clearly. Another way of saying that is that our channels of perception become wider. We become more honest, more open. And that can manifest in ways that are frankly surprising, especially to the person it's happening to. This was true for me, and it was something I alternated between accepting and resisting for a long time, which is a process that still continues in some ways, if I'm being honest. But yes, for me, there was a significant uptick in intuitive awareness, psychic knowing of various kinds, glimpses into what appear to be past lives, etc. And over time, it also became clear that it was possible to share something of the stillness and peace with others without words at all. To enter into a communion with others in a very direct and embodied way, simply by placing a hand on someone's head, which turned out to have clear healing implications, and which took a long time to get used to. If you're curious about that right now, you can click here, learn more about it. It's a big topic, so there'll be other videos coming on that as well. The particular forms that expanded perception may take, or siddhis as they're often classically called, aren't really the point here. They are not guaranteed to come to everyone, nor are they even strictly necessary for awakening quite fully. Yet when the lights come on, you will tend to see more in some fashion. What really matters is that whatever you see and experience might as well be put in service to the journey, not aggrandizement of the ego. That's all. And as for ongoing life in the context of awakening, I'd point you to this video from last summer called What I Wish I Knew About Awakening 10 Years Ago. Most seekers want awakening to make their life better, more fortune, less suffering, better circumstances. But awakening doesn't do that. It does something far stranger. It removes the individuated self around which all that drama spins. When it becomes clear, not as a concept, but as a lived reality, that the individuated personal self has no real substance, that it was never quite what it appeared to be, and could in fact be called an illusion, then fortune and suffering no longer have anything solid to attach to. They still come and go. There's just no longer a someone at the center who's fundamentally threatened by either one. And so equanimity and the peace that passes understanding become a more natural default setting. If that sounds wild or outrageous, well, it kind of is. But only to the egoic, separated sense of self. The fundamental awareness itself simply finds it quietly natural. The great teacher Ramana Maharshi put it this way: the I casts off the illusion of I, and yet remains as I. Such is the paradox of self-realization. The realized do not see any contradiction in it. No contradiction means no conflict. No conflict means peace as the natural default. And that is what the tour looks like from the inside. The peace isn't above the world, it's beneath it and behind it and absolutely all around. And it's available now for any of us, for you, not as an idea, but as something you've recognized. You may already know what I'm pointing at. And if you want to explore it further or simply sit in it together with others who are walking the same direction, that's what I'm here for, and usually why I'm traveling. There are free gatherings, there's a free ebook and meditation, there are one-on-one conversations, there are retreats. All of it lives at assistthespirit.com. And if this video found you at the right moment, it probably wasn't an accident. Peace be with you, my friends. Here's walking in spirit with you. Maybe I'll see you on the trail.